Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now if you've been a long time viewer of the channel, then you may remember that about 3 years ago we put together a console crushing gaming PC. Now this system comprised of an FX 4300 from AMD, 660 Ti and 8GB of RAM. Now at the time I truly believe we achieved what we set out to do, and that was to put together something that cost less than a PlayStation 4 but could not necessarily outperform it, but equal it both visually and in terms of frame rate. Now it cost about £150, 200 US dollars, something like that, and here's a quick recap of how it performed. For example, games like The Witcher 3, GTA 5 and Overwatch ran with respectable settings and frame rates on this system. Since then we've seen the release of many more demanding titles, and this isn't just as far as the PC is concerned, but consoles as well. As we approach the end of the current console generation, we are seeing the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One being truly pushed to their absolute limits. Maybe not the Xbox One X, that still seems to hold up fairly well, but the base consoles may be seen as starting to struggle, especially the original Xbox One or the Xbox One S, which runs a lot of modern titles at lower than 1080p in order to maintain a stable frame rate. Maybe it's even a dynamic resolution. All of this got me thinking, could the console crushing PC that we built 3 years ago still hold up today with titles such as Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Outer Worlds, maybe even PUBG, games that truly do push modern console hardware to its absolute limit? Well, I suppose we should find out. Okay, so just like 3 years ago, I still had the PlayStation 4 primarily in mind when it came to comparative performance. Straight away, I can say that this won't equal the likes of the PS4 Pro or Xbox One X, but 1080p and what is in most titles 30 frames per second, maybe it's not too much of a challenge. So, The Outer Worlds first. The base PS4 runs the game at a dynamic 1920 by 1080, with the lowest being 1280 by 720, I think, at a pretty solid 30 FPS. I don't want to get too technical here, and I honestly don't have the equipment to do so, so I just used a mixture of high, medium and low to try and get the game looking as good as possible while maintaining at least 30 FPS. This is easier said than done, I'm afraid. I have a few results to talk about. With mixed settings and no cap, we saw 41 FPS on average, but the stutter made it pretty much unplayable. I then enabled the 30 FPS cap, and again the same thing. The average, whilst it was 30, was fair enough, but the percentile figures were once again pretty terrible. Next up, I switched everything to low at 1080p and removed the cap once again. This was the smoothest way to play by far, and the game still looked okay. The unique art style really helps to maintain an overall good looking game even at heavily reduced settings, but there will still be a few problems as far as the percentile figures and stutter is concerned. My next plan was to get Red Dead Redemption 2 looking good on this aging combination, but thanks to the VRAM limitation of the 660 Ti, we couldn't change anything past low. This is the absolute lowest the game will go graphical wise without changing the resolution, but I'll have a little bit more on that later on. As you saw at the beginning, the base PS4 runs this at 1080p. Here, you could get away with it in areas that aren't so busy, but it won't be a particularly enjoyable experience, and the frame rate will drop quite a few times in fact. So next up, it's a 2020 release, Doom Eternal. On the base PS4 you're looking at a dynamic resolution, 1080p is the highest, and it will drop below that in busier areas but never as low as say 1280 by 720. It seemed then that the best place to start was at 1080p on our PC here. Unfortunately, 30 FPS wasn't quite doable, and it just adds insult to injury when you remember that Doom targets 60 FPS on the consoles. Don't think for a minute though that I'm saying you can't build a PC that will outperform the base PS4 for £150 or $200 using used parts. You probably can, especially now that prices of better and newer parts can be found cheaper. I'm just saying that this combination isn't the console competitor it once was. I plan to do an updated video though with parts that you should use. I just wanted to revisit this one for fun. So then it's PUBG now, and on PS4 this runs at 30 FPS, which I didn't know. I thought it was 60 for some reason. It is a fixed 1080p resolution though, and that's something that this PC can handle. It's a slightly older game, I know, but it is still receiving updates, and it's still very popular, so it's certainly worth featuring in my videos. 30 FPS at 1080p is no real problem here. Again, I have a couple of results, one uncapped and one capped. Capping the game makes things a lot smoother, like seriously smoother, so I'd recommend doing that. I was using the medium settings here, and honestly it still looks pretty good. Any higher and you'll run into some more performance issues though. Okay, so maybe 1080p resolution is a little bit much for our old console crushing gaming PC, but there's still a little bit of hope left. If we are still comparing it to consoles, then one console to bear in mind in particular is the aforementioned OG Xbox One or Xbox One S. Now this frequently uses less than 1080p resolution in order to maintain a smooth frame rate in games. Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, runs at something like 864p, and there are a whole host of other titles that run at, say, 900p as well. So let's see what our PC makes of 900p resolution, whether or not this is any better, or perhaps the CPU limitation is just too much to achieve a reasonable frame rate across a whole host of modern titles. But let's jump back into it and see how it handles itself at 900p resolution instead. We're going a little bit off the rails here as far as comparing it directly to a console is concerned, but let's just try and get some playable frame rates from this old machine. So this time round, PUBG actually suffered a little more. The lower resolution meant more work for our CPU, which was already pushed to the limit in the previous footage at 1080p. 30 FPS capped was still the best way to play, but there will be some serious stutters here and there. I think I'm going to have to call this unplayable, I'm afraid. Switching from medium to low didn't help either, nor did 720p, because again, the CPU was being stressed further. Okay, so I couldn't resist throwing another slightly older game in here too. Skyrim Special Edition runs very nicely at 900p high. Games from 2016 or before will run the best on this system. Skyrim Special Edition makes some nice visual improvements over the original, though that does come at a cost to performance. I think the biggest problem these days is the FX 4300. We've tested both this and the 660 Ti separately with more powerful hardware in the past to get the most out of each respective part, but together, along with 8 gigs of RAM, it's a mixed experience to say the least. Back to Red Dead, and we're not really gaining much yet again. Performance is about the same at 900p and 720p, though the average was ever so slightly increased. The 2 gigs of RAM, or VRAM I should say, also means that there is no room for manoeuvre as far as upping the texture quality is concerned. Just like before, 30 frames per second is doable in emptier areas of the map, but in town, where you'll spend a lot of your time, performance will suffer. It's the same story in the Outer Worlds, whereby the frame rate is best capped to 30, but even then there is quite a bit of stutter to deal with at 900p. Dropping the resolution increases CPU load, so performance isn't really improved, and turning the resolution up increases GPU load, so again, the already struggling GPU is pushed even harder, and performance once again isn't altered too significantly. Finally, in Doom, the performance is increased a little, to be honest, and the average sits closer to 30 FPS, but there are still issues. I think in conclusion then, our once console crushing PC isn't really up to much anymore. I sort of expected this, but I just thought it would be interesting to revisit this system that we put together 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. I was curious to see how it did, and just like any PC that you build, there will be a time when it can no longer handle the latest games. The 660 Ti though is still more capable, that's for sure, and is probably worth pairing with something a little better processor wise, because some games will still offer respectable performance. And I made a video on the 660 Ti on its own with a Ryzen 5 and 16 gigs of RAM just a couple of months ago. maybe not even that long ago, to be honest, and it performed at 1440p with that processor. But I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.